Bonjour, merci beaucoup pour d'abord pour l'invitation aujourd'hui, mais surtout pour le soutien d'IFRIS pour ma recherche sur le suicide assisté en Suisse, que je prolonge actuellement en tant que chercheur CNRS. I will present in English and we can continue the discussion in French if there are questions or clarifications to be made. And I will present briefly, in the 20 minutes, an overview, very much an overview of the determinations and the results that I could draw out of the first year of fieldwork on this subject. So that's from the end of 2014 to the end of 2015. Let me begin with a little bit of history, a brief return to the history of this practice. Since 1982, a handful of organizations, indicated here, have been established in Switzerland so as to assist people who have different kinds of illnesses to end their lives. Although heterogeneous in terms of whether they assist only Swiss nationals, or whether they also accept foreigners, whether they charge fees, or whether they work as volunteers for free, one common characteristic in all of the now five, continuously existing organizations, as you can see, one no longer exists, is that they're all associations financed by membership dues of their members. And this is important. The practice of assistance with suicide was developed by associations, which is a kind of organization that historically is crucial to the emergence of the public sphere in Europe, and the public sphere as a space of critique and of social transformation. It's important that this is something which is not state-run, state-led, or really to any degree framed by the state, in a very limited fashion. These associations are nevertheless, of course, subject to Swiss law. The law, however, is rather discreet on the matter of assistance with suicide. Article 115 of their criminal code states that any person who for selfish motives incites or assists another to commit or to attempt to commit suicide is liable to a custodial sentence not exceeding 5 years or to a fine. The toleration of this practice, which is not regulated by any positive legal or federal regulatory framework, is consequent to a legal debate that dates back to the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. We can talk more about that if you're interested. However, such a historical precondition notwithstanding, the mobilization of these associations started only in the 1980s. And once again, we can talk in more detail about that if you're interested in why this precise timing. Two groups of citizens in 1982 were inspired by an association already established in the UK in 1935. In Geneva and in Zurich, these groups aimed to provide the technical and moral means and supports for the ending of life. Historically, we can identify two periods in the development of these practices. So the first is 1982 to 1995. It's of interest because viewed from the present, sort of during this beginning year of fieldwork, it's a period that's shrouded in mystery and even in some intentional obfuscation. At the time, officially there were two major organizations working in Switzerland, and those who work in these associations are unclear about what really was going on and what was possible at this time. Now, to put it succinctly, we can see that there were in effect, or there are from today's point of view, two historical narratives about what went on at that period. One is a discontinuity narrative. And the discontinuity narrative says, in effect, between the foundation of the organization and around 1995, we didn't assist with suicides. We gave advice, we made a booklet, we gave moral support, but we didn't really facilitate suicides. Factually, this is incorrect, but it's important that that's a narrative that people within the associations have. And we could call this a naturalization of the present narrative. which is to say that after 1995, then we have a procedure, we have something which is rule-bound, governed by our internal code of conduct, and what have you. But there's also a narrative, factually more correct, which admits that there was a clandestine practice in the first place, between 1982 and 1995. And this narrative takes up the emergence of reflection about procedures, rules, and responsibilities as a reflective response to the increasing visibility of the practice after 1995. So it's a return to the foundation of the practice in that first period, acknowledging that, yes, we were doing assisted suicides, but we didn't really have any formal procedures. What's clear is that taken together, the discontinuity narrative and then the responsibilization narrative, taken together, they frame the period after 1995 as one of formalization. And this is going to be important for the results I show later. As of 1995, on advice from their legal counsel, the Zurich-based association, Exit Deutsche Schweiz, decided only to conduct assisted suicides through work with a team of accompaniers, Sterbehelfer, volunteer personnel who are responsible for guiding the procedure and the practice. Thus, consequent to this decision, a more or less transparent process was created in which a sick person requests assistance with suicide in writing, the dossier is then reviewed by a secretariat, an accompanier is then nominated. If they accept, they enter into contact with the person, and then between them they decide on a date, and then the suicide is realized. The volunteer is then responsible for what happens afterwards, including calling the police. I'm going to show you some of the steps to this. Before doing that, let me just say the only reason, and this is very important, the only reason a doctor is required in the process is in order to have access to the technical means of a suicide, namely access to a prescription for a lethal dose of barbiturate. The legal framework, Article 115 of the Penal Code, states nothing about who can help, under what conditions, through what means. It's only because aesthetically, ethically, and medically, it seems as though an overdose through barbiturate, a barbiturate overdose, is the simplest and least painful, least distressing manner in which to die. A key factor in this period of formalization was the establishment of the association Dignitas, of which I'll show you one or two results. And the reason this was a key factor was because Dignitas was the first association, of which there are now two, to accept foreigners. Prior to 1998, prior to the founding of Dignitas, it was only Swiss citizens or Swiss residents who could be assisted. And this increased the level of scrutiny on the practice, it increased the media profile of this activity, which also meant that they were being scrutinized about how they evaluated their dossier, which meant that the different associations had to be more explicit about the manner in which they reviewed and accepted or rejected different dossiers. In sum, assistance with suicide in Switzerland is a practice that the law neither positively frames, it does not say how to do it or who can do it, nor categorically forbids. And let me just say briefly, this is in a vast contrast to what happens in, for example, some states of the US, in which you have to have a prognosis of 6 months or less. It has to be a terminal illness with 6 months or less in order to be accepted. Practically, every such suicide follows a sequence. There's the request in writing, there's the review, possibly a request for further justification, there's an accord or a green light, the accompanier is nominated, the date is established. During the suicide, or subsequent to the suicide, the accompanier is responsible for calling the police calls the public prosecutor, who opens a suspicious death inquiry, and authorizes the police to intervene with the forensic medical examiner, the médecin légiste. They come to an accord over what happened, the body is left to the family, and the police and the forensic medical examiner produce a report which is then sent to the public prosecutor. And if there are no concerns, the case is closed, which is usually the case. Then, of course, the work of burial and the emotional work of mourning and of working through what happened and trying to integrate it. Let me say just very briefly, in this first year, I have had access to every part of these sequences except the suicide itself, which is something which I am patiently and slowly trying to gain enough trust with the associations and with people who are thinking about this in order to be able to follow. But I can't show you results of this today. So on the one hand, it looks like a very formal procedure. In practice, there are many sites of indetermination, and I'm going to show you 3 that the first year of fieldwork raised. The first is justification. It's not mandatory, as I mentioned before, for the associations that facilitate assisted suicide that the illness is incurable, nor that it is shortly lethal, what's often called terminal illness. A question then is, what illness or what experience of illness justifies such assistance? And in the eyes of whom? In other words, there's no medical moral calculation or norm. Different situations, different illnesses, differences among individuals who act as volunteers, different cantons, different historical moments, demand higher and lower degrees of justification. And justification here meaning how a reason or proof is supposed to associate the legitimacy of a request to the realization of an assisted suicide. And under this general heading, I'm working on 2 articles. So the first, based on 4 cases of completed suicides, I compare the variable forms in which demands for justification were made and the kinds of justification mobilized. 2 cases were of non-resident foreigners at Dignitas, and 2 were of Swiss citizens at exit. 2 illnesses were terminal, 1 was incurable, although not immediately life-threatening, and 1 was chronic and non-life-threatening. It seems to me that they're of interest as 4 cases because it shows you both, it cross-cuts across different associations in Francophone and Germanophone Switzerland, it cross-cuts across terminal illnesses and non-terminal illnesses, and it cross-cuts between varying degrees of justification or the demand for proof. The punchline of this work, to put it briefly, is highlighted in the difference between the red and the blue cases. Cross-cutting illness, severity, and different associations. The red highlights the low-grade form and mode of justification internal to the regime of action of an assisted suicide association, which is to say, typically, for any assisted suicide association, there is a low level of justification demanded in which one writes a letter, one explains one's reasons, and one attaches a medical certificate showing the state of health, the diagnosis, and the possible prognosis. The blue contrast cases highlight that high-grade demands for different forms of justification show you that the demand for a sustained justification is extraneous to either the organizational norms or the particularity of the illness. On the one hand, this seems simple, but it seems to me quite important because normally people associate the question of justification with, yes, but was he or she really sick enough? Do they deserve that kind of help? If one goes in terms of commonplaces or spontaneous sociology, that's often the kind of reflection one encounters. Shouldn't they have waited a little bit longer, or what have you? To give just one example of how this is not the case, the demand of B, a British citizen, to give extra proof of the degree of degradation of his motor neuron disease could have been understood to be consequent to the demand from the doctor working with Dignitas to be a question of whether he was sick enough to warrant leaving the experience of illness, whether he could die, as though it were the doctor who were going to make a judgment over whether he was sick enough. Because in effect, that's how the question was asked. Can you give us more medical proof of the state of your medical condition. Comparing it, however, with case A, we see that someone with, in effect, an osteoporosis, she had a polypathology, she had several other factors as well, but a primary diagnosis of osteoporosis required no extra justification, and indeed one could imagine a doctor saying something along the lines of, one can live very easily with osteoporosis for many, many years. No doubt it's painful and causes suffering, but it's not a life-threatening illness. And in fact, we can see in the difference between April and December 2010, just to give you one example, that this was a moment in which in the canton of Zurich, to which Dignitas is responsible politically and juridically, there was actually mounting pressure from the cantonal authorities on the association, thus showing, if not proving, at least demonstrating one element of why the extra justification was demanded. It seems to me it's much more plausible to say that it's due to the external political pressure rather than anything to do with internal norms of justification relative to the health status of the person. This isn't surprising on the one hand, given the lack of a regulatory framework, as I mentioned at the beginning. Yet, on the other hand, it pinpoints the question of how ethical judgments are configured with other kinds of medical, legal, and political demands, depending on very contingent institutional interfaces. On the basis of this work, and of this general theme of justification and contingent demands for justification, I opened a second line of inquiry about requests for assistance from people with mental illness and the demands for proof in such cases. And I'm close to completing a study of the 2007 criminal trial of a psychiatrist accused of intentional homicide for assisting a mentally ill person to exit his experience of suffering. The paper asks how psychiatric expertise was mobilized in the trial with respect to normative and scientific arguments about the relation of mental illness to the capacity for discernment. The paper demonstrates how conflicting judgments, in this case, judgments meaning both expert medical evaluations and then the resulting legal judgments, how they were based on normative conceptions of medical practice. The curious thing about this case is that after initially being condemned for negligent homicide, he was accused initially of intentional homicide. He was judged in the first instance of negligent homicide for not appropriately acting as a doctor should. In the second instance, he was convicted on appeal of intentional homicide. It was transformed. I thought I would give you, in the 15 minutes, just only that case. Now I thought it might be too claustrophobic going into the details of the argumentation. But it's very curious. On appeal, he was judged of intentional homicide. And then a year later, he was pardoned by the political community in Basel for his action, mandating, nevertheless, that the guilty charge remains. The paper then, the punchline again of the paper here is to show that normative conceptions of medical obligation in these medico-juridical fields are in tension with changing socio-political conceptions of these obligations. At one level, it's a very Durkheimian point, classic point, that there are social tendencies which are in tension with the manner in which fields manage the question of justification and obligation. Again, for all of these points, if there are questions, we can go into them. Second theme is determination. And what I mean by that is how people determine that it is appropriate, better, or necessary even, to leave an experience of illness through an accompanied suicide, what otherwise might be coded as choice. On the one hand, there is an operation, especially in terms of the legal framework, a model of individual decision-making. And yet this model is incomplete, as any sociologist or epidemiologist will tell you. These extra individual determinations to who ends their life in this way, how they do it, and so on, can actually be taken up by the anthropologist or sociologist as a question for interrogation. But in what does such determination consist? Epidemiological data confirms an orthodox Durkheimian vision of this relatively new manner of dying. Statistically, it's an activity correlated with already 20 minutes. Okay. I'll be very quick then. Statistically, it's a Durkheimian picture. People with high education, who live in wealthy neighborhoods, and who have access to cultural capital are statistically overrepresented in the activity. And yet, such social facts notwithstanding, their significance is far from clear. What to actually draw from that statistical picture? I take up this question of the extra-individual determinations of this practice through two points of view. The one is a synchronic question of how actually in the negotiations and interactions between people during the process of assisted suicide, the decision to go ahead and to continue with the process of assisted suicide is actually the result of the discussions and the negotiations rather than being any sort of a foundational point. And you can actually chart this very clearly, even in terms of the micro interactions, like when should I, we're sitting, a couple is sitting, for example, in the kitchen, or in the living area of Dignitas, and they're having a negotiation about when the person should take it. On the other hand, there's also, in addition to a synchronic level, a diachronic level, which is, by that I mean, the question of how a person, relative to their experience, domestic experience, lived experience, how that experience actually matters in the fact that they choose to end their life in this particular way. And this diachronic parameter was something which I hadn't thought of before the fieldwork. It was something which appeared from the fieldwork. And in particular, it appeared in the form of fairly frequently, which is to say 5 times out of the 7 families that I met, the person who was either the person who was a member of Exit but who was not yet ill in 2 cases, or the family member, the wife or the husband of someone who ended their life with Exit, made sense of the fact that the person had left like that by reference to a family story of somebody else, a parent or a parent-in-law, who ended their life relative to, who committed suicide, as one says in English, perhaps erroneously, committed suicide relative to an illness that they were suffering. And what's interesting to me about that diachronic manner of taking up personal choice is that on the one hand, it takes seriously the existence of both conscious and unconscious elements in the experience of illness and the question of how one reacts without pathologizing it. Because in my experience, in particular with the head of psychiatry at the major teaching hospital in Lausanne, in the canton of Vaud, one of his, for example, major critiques of this activity is that it doesn't take the vécu of the person into account, as though these associations are uniquely instrumentalizing death. On the one hand, that's probably more or less correct. What I think is interesting is that, it seems to me at least, he has a basic position of pathologizing the idea of repetition, which is not surprising for a psychoanalytically oriented psychiatrist. It's the Todestrieb, the pathological repetition of a prior trauma. Whereas in fact, it seems to me in the manner in which other people, and even sometimes the person themselves, make sense of how it is that the person repeated a prior action, it's not actually lived tragically, but actually in a certain way, it makes sense as the opening of a space of possibility, or of the opening of an experience of possibility for how one might die. I will then very, very briefly just say the third theme is signification. There's a lot of reference to dignity around assisted suicide. And one of my questions is, what does the obviousness of this symbol constitute for the people that actually do this activity? And let me just finish with a comparison between, on the right, assisted suicide, taken from a documentary about that practice from 2010, compared with Frederick Wiseman's documentary Near Death, which was filmed at the end of the 1980s, in which questions of living wills and choices about how one dies were becoming to be thematized in the United States. And one of the things which, when you listen to people that work in both palliative care and in assisted suicide, there are differing perspectives over what gestures of dignity involve. And so here we have two contrasting pictures or images of what a dignified dying might constitute. So thank you very much.
Je suis un petit peu étonné par la faiblesse du contexte institutionnel, le peu d'importance qu'il a. Si tu peux commenter là-dessus.
Sur un peu la place que joue le médical dans cette histoire. C'est-à-dire pas la question de la fourniture du produit, comme tu as dit, qui est d'une certaine manière l'étape obligée, mais le fait que toute la gestion complexe du problème du choix se fait aussi en relation avec qu'est-ce que c'est le contexte médical plus général de discussion sur le suicide. Bon, et là, je pense tu as mentionné très très brièvement la question de santé mentale et la manière du coup dont ça peut jouer à la fois dans les pratiques de l'association, c'est-à-dire le fait de prendre ça en compte comme un des paramètres dans l'évaluation de la légitimité de la demande, donc de la légitimité du choix. Bon, d'une part, et d'autre part, du côté plus, d'une certaine manière, des médecins et des professionnels de santé qui sont impliqués dans la discussion sur le suicide assisté, le fait que la prévention du suicide, donc la demande de suicide comme une manifestation d'emblée déjà d'une pathologie ou de quelque chose qui relève de la santé mentale, voilà, qui est un élément au cœur de la psychiatrie. Donc du coup, comment il gère ça par rapport au cadre libéral, d'une certaine manière, du choix individuel revendiqué?
Peut-être d'abord la question de Sarah sur à qui parle la justice, si on peut le dire comme ça. Je te donne cet exemple, le cas D. C'était une femme en attente d'un glioblastome, low grade, c'est-à-dire pendant 15 ans ça n'a pas bougé. Et tout d'un coup, un jour, elle commence à avoir des symptômes, son mari médecin lui convainc de faire un IRM. Ça montre que ça a beaucoup bougé, il fallait absolument intervenir. Ils étaient en Vaud, ils sont allés à Zurich pour le faire opérer, très dur. Et en fait, ça a eu un effet, mais ça n'a pas guéri le truc. Elle a décidé très vite de faire appel à Exit. Elle l'a fait. 2 mois ou même 6 semaines après, elle est partie. Tout ça pour dire que 2 mois après, le mari reçoit un coup de fil du procureur du Vaud en disant « Vous êtes appelé devant le cour pour justifier pourquoi vous avez laissé votre femme partir comme ça. » Pourquoi? Parce que le médecin légiste, en intervenant dans la situation, a vu dans le dossier médical que c'était écrit glioblastome bénigne. Qui était techniquement vrai, oui, mais non, parce qu'en fait, oui, c'était bénigne pendant 15 ans et après ça a bougé. Du coup, juste ça pour dire que c'est adressé à la fois à le mari de cette femme, mais aussi au médecin qui a fait la prescription, l'ordonnance pour la dose létale de barbiturique, mais aussi l'accompagnatrice qui était avec eux. C'est-à-dire tous les trois qui étaient dans la scène, dans la mise en scène et le soutien de cette situation étaient appelés devant le cour. C'est-à-dire, c'est ciblé sur les individus c'est nominaliste, je veux dire, que c'est ciblé sur les individus qui comprisent l'association et pas l'association en tant que telle. J'ai jamais entendu l'association en tant que sujet d'un appel juridique. Et pour répondre à ces questions du procès, les raisons pour lesquelles le psychiatre Peter Baumann a fondé sa propre association Suizidhilfe en 2001, c'était parce que Exit Deutsche Schweiz n'avait plus le droit d'aider des personnes avec des maladies mentales à cause d'une pression cantonale du médecin cantonal qui était contre. Il n'y avait rien dans la loi qui a pu soutenir cette position, mais il avait le pouvoir de les interdire de le faire. Et s'il continuait de le faire, il pouvait être, expulsé de l'ordre médical. Il ne pouvait plus pratiquer en Suisse, ou à Zurich, en l'occurrence, parce que ce n'est pas fédéral. Et du coup, quand lui, il a fondé sa propre association, c'était lui. Et donc, il était appelé en tant à titre personnel devant le cours. Pour répondre à cette question de la faiblesse de l'institutionnalisation, moi aussi, je suis d'accord que c'est ça qui était... Et aussi, c'est pour moi, c'est ça l'intrigue anthropologique, c'est-à-dire, je m'intéresse beaucoup moins sur les cas, le cas de Belgique ou Pays-Bas ou de Luxembourg, où il y a un cadre légal très très précis. Et ça devrait être clair, les normes, comment... J'imagine en pratique, ce n'est pas... Je suis d'accord avec vous. J'imagine qu'il y a des exceptions et des questions des engrais, comme ça. Mais comme cadre légal, c'est clair. Ou sinon, aux États-Unis, c'est très clair comment faire, ou sous quel titre on est justifié à faire appel à un tel aide. En Suisse, il n'y a rien de tout ça, donc tout est ouvert. Et là, il me semble, la question de l'obligation d'un médecin à répondre à une demande d'un autre, c'est-à-dire, moi, je souffre de quelque chose, je vous mettre ça en récit, vous l'entendez, et après, vous réagissez. Vous me dites, qu'est-ce que vous pensez? Est-ce que vous êtes prête à m'aider? Et pour moi, il y a quelque chose de... C'est éthique à la base. C'est l'appel de l'un et l'écoute de l'autre. Et la question de comment il parle de ça, comment il justifie ça, quand il devrait le justifier. Et après, on a la question de cette configuration. Parfois, ça va au-delà d'une justification éthique. C'est politique, c'est légal. Et après, la question de Jean-Paul, ce que moi j'entends, c'est vraiment la question qui n'est pas claire du tout chez les associations, du distinction entre un suicide et un suicide assisté. C'est-à-dire, est-ce qu'un suicide assisté est un suicide ou pas? Et eux, ils sont perturbés par cette question, jusqu'à un point où ils refusent. C'est-à-dire, pour la plupart des personnes dans l'association, c'est-à-dire les membres, refusent de parler de suicide. Ils font des autodélivrances. Le président, qui est un médecin, parle de suicide. Pour lui, c'est très clair, suicide assisté, c'est une forme de suicide, dans un sens neutre. Mais pour les membres, ils veulent faire les distinctions et les différences entre un suicide, juste pour reprendre les mots de quelqu'un, suicide est quand on se jette d'un pont ou d'une fenêtre, ça c'est un suicide. Là, ce qu'on fait avec le barbiturique, ça c'est autre chose, ça c'est une autodélivrance. C'est-à-dire, il souligne le fait que c'est un choix rationnel, c'est encadré, c'est social, c'est encadré dans une discussion, dans un débat, en négociation avec d'autres. Mais justement, comme vous soulignez, dans un cas de quelqu'un avec une maladie psychique, avec une maladie mentale, la question c'est comment maintenir cette distinction entre suicide et autodélivrance. Et justement, Baumann, c'est ça l'intérêt du procès. Il essaie de dire, bah voilà, vous avez un double standard, c'est-à-dire en tant que psychiatre, expert psychiatre, je maintiens le droit de dire que quelqu'un avec une maladie psychique n'est pas donc quelqu'un qui n'a pas le discernement, la capacité de décider pour soi-même. Et il y a plusieurs confrères qui sont d'accord avec lui. Néanmoins, l'institution juridico-médicale à Bâle n'était pas d'accord du tout avec lui. C'est-à-dire, ils disent pour eux, quelqu'un qui n'a pas une maladie physique, qui souhaite mourir d'une telle façon, est d'office dépressif. Et donc, si on est dépressif, on n'a plus le discernement. C'est-à-dire dépressif grave, serious depression, sustained depression. Du coup, moi, j'essaie de les suivre. Je n'ai pas un propos extérieur de eux.
D'accord, merci.
Merci beaucoup.